The kitchen was filled with the familiar morning sounds, clinking dishes, the steady drip of the coffee maker, the quiet sizzling of pancakes on the stove. It was all too familiar, almost suffocating in its routine. Richard sat at the head of the table, a newspaper in front of him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He flipped through the pages, pretending to read, but the silence between him, Abigail, and their daughter Victoria felt overwhelming. Abigail was buttering toast in the background, but the warmth she once brought to the room was gone. "Are you going to the office today?" Abigail asked, flipping a pancake without even looking at him. Her voice was neutral, but the tenderness that used to color even their simplest conversations had vanished. Richard glanced over the top of the newspaper, watching her from the corner of his eye. She went through the motions, speaking to him like a stranger, as if the closeness that had once existed between them was now a distant memory. It felt as if the connection between them had dried up. They lived together, but it was more like sharing a space than living a life together. "Yes, I have meetings. I should be back by 5, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Abigail nodded without turning around. No, good luck, no, have a good day. Just the cold silence that had taken root between them. Richard watched her for a few more seconds, noticing her tense movements, how she avoided meeting his gaze. Something had changed between them long ago, but neither of them wanted, or perhaps could, talk about it. With a sigh, he took a sip of his coffee, but it had already gone cold. On the other side of the table, Victoria was absorbed in her phone, her fingers flying across the screen with a focus she rarely gave to anything else. She didn't even look up when Abigail placed a plate of pancakes in front of her. "How's college going, Victoria?" Richard asked, trying to break through the wall she had built around herself. "Fine," she muttered, not lifting her eyes from the phone. "Always the same. Fine." No details, no conversation. He didn't know what subjects she liked, who her friends were, or what her plans were after graduation. The lively conversations they used to have had dwindled to nothing, and he felt like a stranger in his own home. He took a deep breath, suppressing the growing frustration. This was his daughter, the little girl who used to run to greet him after work, cuddle up next to him on the couch, and laugh at cartoons. Now she barely noticed him. "Anything interesting happening at college?" he asked again, hoping for any reaction. Victoria sighed heavily, as if even talking was too much effort. No. A knot formed in his stomach, but he didn't push. What was the point? Every attempt at conversation felt hopeless. He glanced over at Abigail, who was still standing by the stove, her back to him. She had heard their brief exchange, or lack thereof, but said nothing. She didn't try to help, didn't try to bridge the gap between him and their daughter like she used to. It seemed like she no longer cared. He wanted to ask her, to figure out what had gone wrong between them, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? He didn't even know exactly what was wrong, only that the family he loved was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. Finally, Abigail sat down at the table with her own plate, focusing on her food. Richard searched her face, hoping for some sign, something to show that they were still connected, even in the smallest way. But she didn't look up. "What are your plans for today?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Abigail shrugged, cutting into her pancake. "Nothing special. A few errands. Might stop by my mom's." It was the same answer she gave almost every day. She used to share everything with him, her thoughts, her plans, what excited her. Now it seemed she had a life of her own, one he was no longer part of. "You've been going to your mom's a lot lately," Richard noted, trying to keep his voice calm, though the tension was evident. Abigail froze mid-bite, and for the first time in a long while, looked him in the eyes. Richard couldn't shake the image of the moment Abigail's gaze became distant, as if she had closed a door between them. "She's just been feeling a bit under the weather lately. You know how it gets with her," Abigail had said in a casual tone, but something in her words felt off. He sensed it, something hidden. It wasn't obvious, but he could feel it. Yes, she was indeed visiting her mother, but not as often as she claimed. Too many late returns without explanations, too many vague answers. Maybe we could have dinner together tonight, just the two of us, he suggested, hoping it would bring them closer, rekindle the intimacy they had lost. Abigail's face remained expressionless. Maybe, if I'm back in time. Her words, which once carried warmth, now sounded like excuses. Richard stared at his plate, his appetite fading. Across the room, Victoria abruptly stood up, phone in hand. "I'm going to Katie's after college. I won't be home for dinner," she announced indifferently, already heading for the door before they had a chance to respond. Richard watched her leave, and the soft click of her bedroom door echoed in his ears. He sat in silence, feeling the growing tension. This was his life now, a wife who barely spoke to him, and a daughter who acted as if he didn't exist. The love that once filled their home had been replaced by a coldness he could no longer ignore. He glanced at Abigail, still scrolling through something on her phone, her breakfast untouched. The distance between them felt like an insurmountable chasm, growing wider with every passing second. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find a way to bridge it. For weeks, a suffocating suspicion had been building inside him, as if something was happening beyond his understanding, something he couldn't quite see. A secret, perhaps, or a lie. Something that would explain why everything was falling apart so quickly. But every time he tried to make sense of it, it slipped through his fingers, leaving him even more confused and angry. Abigail's phone ringing snapped him out of his thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable, and abruptly stood up. "I've got a busy day. See you tonight," she muttered tensely, heading for the door. Before Richard could say a word, she was already gone, and the soft click of the door only deepened his loneliness. And once again, he was left alone in the kitchen, the silence wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He stared at the table, at the untouched plates of food, feeling the emptiness inside him grow. Something was terribly wrong. He didn't know what, but he felt it in his soul. His family was slipping away from him, and he had no idea how to stop it. Later that evening, Richard paced in front of Victoria's room, his frustration boiling over. Dinner with Abigail had once again been filled with strained, empty conversation. Victoria didn't join them again, claiming she had homework. After dinner, Abigail retreated to the bedroom with her phone, and Richard tried to distract himself with the TV, but the unease wouldn't leave him. The coldness between them had become unbearable. As he walked past Victoria's room, he froze. He heard voices, quiet, muffled. She usually talked on the phone, but this time something felt different. He stepped closer. The whispers became clearer, though the words were still indistinct. But there was something in the tone that made him uneasy. Curiosity pulled him forward, even though he knew eavesdropping was wrong. But something pushed him to keep going. Holding his breath, he pressed his ear against the door, and then he heard it. "I want everyone to know that Uncle Daniel is my real father, not that loser." Richard froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind refused to process what he had just heard. Uncle Daniel? His brother Daniel? Her real father? Inside the room, Victoria's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. "I'm tired of pretending, Mom. I want him out of my life." Richard's heart pounded so loudly that he could barely think, each beat reverberating through his chest like a drum. The words he had just overheard kept spinning in his head on repeat, refusing to make sense. His daughter, his own flesh and blood, had called him a failure, rejected him as if he meant nothing. But the real blow, the one that nearly knocked him off his feet, followed right after. She called Daniel her real father. Before the pain of her words could fully settle into his mind, another voice pierced through his shock, leaving him utterly confused. Abigail, his wife, was speaking softly, as if confiding in their daughter. "I know, darling. Just wait a little longer," she murmured. "As soon as I get the house and the business under my name, everything will be ours. Then we'll get rid of him." The ease with which she said those words made Richard feel his legs buckle. He grabbed onto the doorframe, his body trembling as the reality of what was happening dawned on him. The woman he had spent 33 years with, his partner, his wife, was plotting against him. But worse, their daughter was part of the plan, actively helping to erase him from their lives. This wasn't just an affair. This was a meticulously planned betrayal, aimed at stripping him of everything he had built. The weight of this realization pressed down on him, stealing his breath. He stood frozen, breathing shallowly, his hands gripping the doorframe like it was his last tether to reality. Part of him wanted to burst into the room, confront them, demand answers, scream. But something inside him held him back. A cold, logical voice warned that if he exploded now, they would just deny everything. They would cover their tracks. He needed to act strategically. He needed proof. Through the haze of disbelief, Victoria's voice cut through the air again, sharp and clear. "Why not just get rid of him now? He won't put up a fight. He's too weak." Her words twisted Richard's stomach, sending a wave of nausea through him. Abigail's light laugh followed, a sound that now made his skin crawl. "We can't rush," Abigail said, her voice laced with superiority. "We need to make sure the house and business are legally ours first. After that, he'll have nowhere to go. Trust me, it's worth the wait." Richard stepped back from the door, feeling the nausea rise. The urge to confront them was burning inside him, but he forced himself to walk away. They couldn't know he had heard everything. Not yet. He needed time to think, to plan his next move. Even though his world had just crumbled, he knew he had to keep his composure. Their voices echoed in his head as he walked down the hallway. His daughter's rejection, his wife's plan to discard him. A deep, unfamiliar pain gripped his chest. When he reached the kitchen, he slumped against the counter, his mind in turmoil. Daniel, his brother, his own flesh and blood had betrayed him too. The charming, golden boy had seduced his wife. And Victoria, was she even his daughter? Had his entire life been a lie? Fragments of the past crashed over him like a freight train. Late nights when Abigail claimed to be out on business, her cold touch, the growing distance with Victoria. He had excused it all, chalking it up to the natural drift of a long marriage, to the rebellion of a growing child. But now, the truth stood before him in all its cruelty. They had been planning this for years, biding their time while he lived in blissful ignorance. His fists clenched, fury and betrayal boiling inside him. He wanted to scream, to break something, but he knew losing control now was not an option. Mechanically, he opened the refrigerator, staring blankly at its contents, seeing nothing. His mind was already elsewhere, forming a plan. He couldn't confront them now. He needed irrefutable proof. A DNA test for Victoria. Evidence of Abigail's affair. He needed to find out just how deep this betrayal ran. Closing the fridge, Richard leaned against the counter, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. His life had just collapsed, but he wasn't about to let them see him fall. Not yet. He would gather the evidence, and when the time was right, he would strike, exposing them as the liars they were. Richard felt an unbearable weight pressing down on him, as if a destructive truth had wrapped around his body, suffocating him. The life he once thought was his marriage, his family, had turned out to be a fragile illusion. Lies had seeped into every corner of what he once considered sacred. The house was ominously quiet. The muted sounds from Victoria's room had faded, leaving only the occasional creak of floorboards upstairs, where Abigail was likely preparing for bed. She had no idea that Richard's world had just collapsed beneath him. He took a deep breath, trying to regain control of himself, and headed for the stairs. He needed to maintain appearances, at least for now. If Abigail sensed even the slightest hint of his suspicions, she might change her behavior, and Richard couldn't allow that. Not with so much now at stake. Each step intensified the question tearing him apart from the inside. How long had this been going on? How long had he been living in a lie, believing his family was strong when it had already crumbled. When he reached the bedroom, Abigail was already in bed, her back turned to him. The soft glow of her phone screen illuminated her face as she scrolled through her feed, paying no attention to his presence. She didn't look up when he entered, and no words were exchanged between them. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, turning his back to her as well. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his shoes, his actions mechanical, as though his mind were far away. Thoughts raced in chaotic swirls, but he forced himself to remain composed. He needed time, to think, to plan. This wasn't the end. He couldn't let them walk away unpunished. Lying beside her, he felt an immense chasm stretching between them, an impassable distance. The woman lying next to him was no longer the one he once knew. She had become a stranger, an accomplice in the betrayal that had shattered his life. But still, he remained silent. Without a word, Abigail turned off her phone, placed it on the nightstand, and pulled the blanket over herself, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside Richard. He stared at the ceiling, his mind already forming a plan, and when the time was right, he would strike. The next week, Richard went through his daily routine with calculated calm, hiding the fury that boiled beneath the surface. Every move he made was precise, revealing not a trace of the anger that raged inside. He kissed Abigail goodbye each morning as if nothing had changed, maintaining the facade, though each kiss felt like slow poison, eating away at him from within. He was simply biding his time, counting down the days until he could make his move. Confronting Abigail or his brother too early would give them a chance to twist the truth, to wriggle out of the situation. That was unacceptable. He needed solid evidence, irrefutable proof that would leave no room for manipulation. So he turned to George Smith, a private investigator known for his discretion and skill in uncovering the darkest secrets. "I need to know if my wife is seeing someone else," Richard said when they met in a dimly lit cafe on the other side of town. "And not just anyone, my brother." George listened attentively, his face neutral but understanding. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Once we start, there's no going back." Richard didn't hesitate. His voice was firm, though inside he felt anything but. "I'm sure. I need the truth, and I need the evidence." Without delay, George began surveilling Abigail with meticulous precision, giving her no chance to suspect anything. The first few days revealed nothing unusual. Abigail stuck to her usual routine: errands, yoga classes, visits to Richard's mother. But on the fourth day, everything changed. George sent Richard a photo that shattered any last doubts he had. There was Abigail, holding hands with Daniel, entering a hotel with him. Seeing that image on his phone, Richard felt as though he'd been punched in the gut. There they were, his wife and his brother, walking into a hotel as if it were the most natural thing in the world. All the excuses, the late nights, it had all been lies. And Daniel, his own brother, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. Richard's hands shook as he stared at the photo, but he didn't let his emotions escape. Not yet. He still had work to do. Silently, he forwarded the photo to his lawyer, knowing the next phase of his plan had already begun. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Richard knew that suspicions alone wouldn't be enough. He needed undeniable proof to confront Abigail and Daniel, something they couldn't deny or twist into another lie. The next step involved Victoria, and the thought of it made him sick. The possibility that the daughter he had loved for almost 22 years wasn't his gnawed at him, but he had to be sure. Without letting Abigail or Victoria suspect anything, he took a sample from her toothbrush and sent it for a DNA test. 2 days later, the results arrived. Richard sat in his car, feeling the weight of fear pressing down on him as he opened the envelope. The world around him blurred as his eyes scanned the words confirming his worst nightmare. Victoria was not his biological child. The report was cold, clinically precise, but it felt like a dagger piercing his chest. There was no biological connection between him and the girl he had cherished. The foundation of his life crumbled before him, built on lies he had never suspected. His heart shattered, betrayal, disappointment, the realization that the life he thought was his had been a cruel illusion. But Richard wasn't going to drown in sorrow. Instead, he clung to his fury, raw, searing anger that burned through him. Abigail had deceived him for nearly 23 years, making him believe Victoria was his while she carried on her affair with Daniel. She had used him, manipulated him, and now was plotting to take everything from him. But Richard wasn't going to let her win. Gradually, a cold, calculated plan formed in his mind. He wasn't just going to expose their betrayal, he intended to destroy them. His first step was to call his lawyer. He needed to ensure that the divorce would leave Abigail with nothing. "I want everything locked down," he firmly stated during the call. "The house, the business, she gets nothing." Mia, his sharp-tongued lawyer, was quick to act. "Understood," she replied, "but you'll have to keep up appearances until everything is finalized." "I can manage," Richard responded confidently, and he did. Every morning he smiled at Abigail, kissed her on the cheek, and played the role of the unsuspecting husband. He ignored her constant messages, pretended not to notice her increasingly frequent business trips. Outwardly, he remained calm while his private investigator, George, quietly gathered evidence. Richard needed every detail to be flawless: photos, dates, even recorded conversations. George did not disappoint. He tracked Abigail's every move, snapping pictures each time she visited Daniel's apartment. He even recorded an incriminating conversation between them, their voices echoing ominously in the night. Late one evening, Richard sat alone in his office, listening to the recording. His fingers turned white as he gripped the edge of the desk, while Abigail's smug voice filled the room. "Once I get the house and the business, we'll be together," she said with clear satisfaction. "He has no idea. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late." Daniel's low, content voice responded, "You've always been smart, Abigail. I can't wait for the three of us to be together." Richard's jaw tightened. A tense shudder ran through his body, but he held back. It wasn't time to act just yet. When everything was in place, Richard began the final phase of his plan. He organized a family trip, something they hadn't done in years. He disguised it as a surprise for Victoria's birthday, promising a special trip for the three of them. Neither Abigail nor Victoria suspected anything. It was Victoria's 22nd birthday, and a strange, unspoken tension filled the house. Abigail hummed a cheerful tune as she set the table for their cozy family dinner, practically glowing with excitement. Richard knew why. She believed this year would mark the beginning of her new life. Victoria, curled up on the couch with her phone, occasionally looked up with a smile, thinking about what her birthday might bring. Richard sat quietly at the table, watching them both. But his thoughts were far ahead, anticipating the inevitable downfall they would never see coming. Every moment of eye contact, every smile, every casual interaction between Abigail and Victoria felt to Richard like a dagger slowly piercing his heart. Yet, to those around him, he still appeared as the perfect image of a caring husband and father, expertly hiding the storm of emotions behind a calm exterior. His plan was almost ready, but for now, he had to continue playing the game a little longer. "Hey, birthday girl," he called out to Victoria, approaching her with a warm smile that felt foreign to him. "How about we do something different this year? Maybe take a spontaneous trip?" His voice was light and playful, concealing the dark intentions lurking behind his words. Victoria's eyes instantly lit up, and she exchanged a glance with Abigail, excitement sparking between them. They had no idea what awaited them. "A trip, Dad? Really?" Victoria asked, finally putting down her phone for the first time all day. "Of course," Richard replied, forcing a strained smile onto his face. "We're leaving tomorrow. Pack light. I've already arranged everything." Abigail, clearly thrilled, unexpectedly hugged him. Such a rare gesture after weeks of estrangement. "This is going to be wonderful, darling. The three of us again like old times," she said with a smile that made Richard's insides churn. He resisted the strong urge to pull away from her touch. She was blissfully unaware that her life was about to collapse. The next morning, Richard woke up early. He packed the car, maintaining the facade of laughter and smiles as if nothing was amiss. Abigail was pleased with herself, thinking she had everything under control. Even Victoria, usually detached, seemed excited about the trip. Every move Richard made was deliberate. Every bag loaded into the car had a specific purpose in his plan. The luggage seemed perfect for a weekend getaway, but it was only part of the deception. Abigail and Victoria believed they were headed to their favorite beach house, but Richard had a much darker destination in mind. As he shut the trunk, he took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what was about to unfold. When Abigail and Victoria finally came downstairs, the car was ready, and Richard greeted them with the same practiced smile he had worn for weeks. They got into the car, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Abigail and Victoria were too engrossed in talking about what awaited them on their vacation to notice anything wrong. "So, where are we going?" Abigail asked, casting him a playful glance from the passenger seat. There was a glint in her eyes. Whether it was anticipation or something more sinister, Richard couldn't tell. She thought she had won. She believed everything was finally going her way. But Richard kept his eyes on the road, his voice steady and composed. "It's a surprise," he said simply. Abigail turned to Victoria with a smirk. "Can't wait to see what your father has planned," she remarked. Victoria smiled faintly, though her attention remained fixed on her phone, as usual. The journey continued in an almost serene rhythm, accompanied by the quiet hum of the engine. But when Richard turned off the main highway onto a familiar road, Abigail's expression began to change. She recognized the route. They weren't heading to the beach house. They were on their way to his mother's house. Her confusion was immediate. "Wait, why are we going this way?" she asked, the smile beginning to fade from her face. "This isn't the road to the beach," she noted. Richard remained silent, the tension in the air growing thicker by the minute. He could feel Abigail's anxiety mounting as they neared his mother's house. When they finally pulled up to the house where his brother Daniel also lived, Abigail's confusion turned to suspicion. She shot Richard a wary glance, her voice trembling. "Richard, what's going on?" Victoria, sensing something was wrong, looked up from her phone. "Yeah, Dad. What's happening?" Richard parked the car, his thoughts a storm, though his face remained impassive. He turned to both of them, his eyes cold and unreadable. "In a way, yes. But first, there's something you need to see." Before either of them could respond, Richard got out, walked to the trunk, and retrieved a brown envelope along with a suitcase. Abigail and Victoria exchanged nervous glances, not daring to get out of the car. "What's going on?" Victoria asked anxiously. This birthday was supposed to be a joyful occasion, but nothing had hinted it would take such a turn. Richard returned and stood beside them, holding the envelope. Without a word, he handed it to Abigail. She hesitated, confusion flashing in her eyes, before she slowly opened it. Her face turned pale as she scanned its contents. It was a DNA test. Her hands began to tremble as she flipped through the pages. "Richard, what is this?" she whispered, her voice shaky, fear creeping into her expression. "This," he replied in a cold, calm tone, "is exactly what you deserve." He turned to Victoria, feeling a knot tighten in his chest, but his voice remained steady. "It's a DNA test," he said icily. "It proves you are not my daughter." Victoria stared at him, her eyes wide in disbelief, her face turning ghostly white. "What? What do you mean, Dad?" she stammered, panic setting in. Richard looked at her, his gaze void of any warmth that might have once been there. "Ask your gold-digging mother and your real father," he spat venomously. I'm done with this. Abigail's hands shook as she continued flipping through the documents, her breathing becoming erratic, teetering on the edge of hyperventilation. No, this can't be true. I can explain everything, she started. But Richard cut her off, his voice dangerously calm. Don't even try, Abigail. I've heard it all, he said with icy composure. That night you and Victoria were discussing your plan, how you'd kick me out as soon as I signed over the house and the business to you. I've known about your affair for months. Tears welled up in Abigail's eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she reached out to him. Richard, please, forgive me. We can fix this. We can still fix everything, she begged. Richard laughed bitterly, without joy, shaking his head. There's nothing left to fix, Abigail. You've been lying to me for 23 years, maybe even longer. You used me, schemed behind my back, and all of it with my own brother. His expression hardened, and he cast his gaze to the ground. And now you think you're going to take everything from me? He said, his voice firm as steel. Victoria sat frozen in the back seat, her face ashen, her hands gripping the seat tightly. Dad, I didn't know any of this, she said quietly. Richard gave her a disappointed look. Maybe you didn't know the whole truth, Victoria, but you knew enough. You called me a loser. You wanted everyone to know that Daniel is your real father. Well, congratulations. Now everyone knows. He pulled out another set of documents. And this, Abigail, he said emotionlessly, is the divorce paperwork. It's already been filed. I'm done with both of you. No! Abigail screamed, jumping out of the car and running towards him. She grabbed his arm, her eyes filled with desperation. Richard, please, I made a mistake. I'll do anything. Just don't leave us. Don't leave me. Richard yanked his arm away sharply, his face cold and distant, as if carved from stone. You made your choices, Abigail. Now you have to live with them. Ask Daniel how he plans to take care of you, because I'm done. Richard threw the stack of papers to the ground without even glancing at them, and quickly walked toward his car. Behind him, Abigail's sobs echoed, while Victoria stood motionless, unable to utter a single word. He drove away without looking back, feeling an odd sense of peace. The weight of their betrayal had finally lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time in many years, Richard felt free. They had schemed against him, betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. But now, in the end, it was they who were left broken and empty. Everything they had tried to steal from him, he had taken back. Richard left them with nothing, only their guilt and each other's company. Now, as the morning sun streamed into his office, he sat at his desk, carefully reviewing the final details of his plan. It had only been a few weeks since that decisive day when he left, abandoning them in front of her mother's house like lost children. But in those few weeks, everything in his world had changed dramatically. He acted swiftly, contacting the right people and ensuring that neither Abigail nor Daniel would recover from the destruction they had brought upon themselves. His first step was to reclaim his business. Armed with DNA test results and undeniable evidence of their affair, he immediately called his lawyer and filed for full control of the company. Abigail, who once thought she could take everything from him, now had nothing. As he signed the final legal document, Richard muttered, "She had no idea what I was capable of when it came to protecting what was mine." The lawyer assured him that the DNA results would be enough to nullify any claims Abigail had for child support. She had planned to use the system to her advantage, but now the court was entirely on Richard's side. The judge was shocked by the depth of their betrayal, and Richard's victory came with little effort. But courtroom victories weren't enough for him. Richard needed more. He wanted the truth about Abigail and Daniel to become public knowledge. He started by casually sharing details of their affair with mutual friends. The reactions ranged from shock to sympathy, but soon they gave way to disgust, and the scandal reignited. Their once tight-knit social circle quickly turned its back on Abigail and Daniel. But Richard didn't stop there. He sent copies of the DNA results to their families, colleagues, and even neighbors. Within days, their reputations were irreversibly ruined. No one who once respected them could look at them the same way again. One afternoon, while sitting in his living room with a cup of coffee, Richard received yet another message. He glanced at the screen, unsurprised to see Abigail's name. Her messages had been incessant over the past week, long, tear-filled apologies, filled with regret and pleas for forgiveness. He opened the latest message, his expression unchanged as he read her words. "Richard, please, I'm begging you. I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted this to happen. I love you and know I've made terrible mistakes. I'll do anything to fix this. Please don't leave us like this. We were happy once. I know we can be again. Give me a chance to explain. Don't destroy everything, at least for Victoria's sake." He stared at the message for a few moments, his finger hovering over the screen. But his heart had grown too cold. There was no room left for forgiveness after everything they had done. The memories of that night, when he overheard their betrayal, still haunted him, their plans to take everything from him while making him look like a complete fool. Abigail's remorse meant nothing to him anymore. Without hesitation, he deleted the message. That evening, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, Victoria stood there, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling. "Dad," she whispered barely audibly, "can we talk? I didn't know everything, I swear. I didn't—" Richard cut her off before she could say more, his voice calm but firm. "Victoria, I've had enough. I'm done with both of you." He had raised her, loved her, but the weight of their betrayal was too heavy to bear. "Is this really fair? After everything I sacrificed for you? You call me worthless and say you wish your uncle were your father." She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat, unable to break through the heavy silence hanging between them. "I owe you nothing," Richard replied coldly and sharply. Without waiting for an answer, he slammed the door right in her face. The loud bang echoed in the silence. Victoria remained standing on the doorstep, her sobs the only sound in the empty space. Inside, Richard's chest tightened with the familiar ache, but he quickly suppressed it. There was no room for second chances. The wound left by her betrayal was too deep, too fresh to ever heal. While Richard battled with his inner turmoil, Daniel's life was crumbling before his eyes, and Richard made sure it happened. Exposing Daniel's affair to his boss, a man who valued family above all, left no room for forgiveness. In just a few days, Daniel lost his job, his reputation collapsed. What he had built for years was destroyed in an instant. He became an outcast, unable to find work, and his financial stability vanished before his eyes. Abigail was no better off. Without a job, without child support from Richard, and utterly alone, she struggled to stay afloat. The friends who were once by her side had disappeared, leaving her alone in a house that no longer felt like home. She kept telling herself she could manage, that somehow she could come out on top. But now it became painfully clear just how devastatingly she had lost. And the final blow was still to come. Richard wasn't satisfied with merely exposing their affair. He wanted justice. He met with his lawyer, gathering undeniable evidence to accuse Abigail and Daniel of paternity fraud. The legal battle wore everyone down, but Richard was relentless. In court, Abigail and Daniel sat together, their faces pale as the incriminating evidence piled up. The DNA test confirmed the truth, and the detailed investigation of their affair left no room for doubt. The judge didn't mince words, condemning their actions as not only morally unacceptable, but criminal as well. The verdict was in Richard's favor, and Abigail and Daniel were convicted of fraud. As they were led away in handcuffs, Richard watched from the back of the courtroom, his expression unreadable. Perhaps at one time he would have felt pity or even regret, but that time had long passed. Now, there was only satisfaction. They had deceived him, used him, and thought they could get away with it. But Richard made sure they paid for every lie, every betrayal. In the months following the trial, He found a peace he hadn't felt in years. He threw himself into his work, expanding his business and focusing on rebuilding his life from the ashes of the past. He traveled, reconnected with old friends, and found solace in the quiet simplicity of his new life. Now, everything was on his terms. As for Abigail and Daniel, their lives were ruined. Prison had stripped them of everything: friends, family, the future. Their betrayal cost them everything. Victoria had distanced herself from them as well. She had tried to contact Richard, hoping for reconciliation, but their last encounter made one thing clear: he would never forgive her. The decisions she made were irreversible, and now she had to live with the consequences. Richard felt no guilt for his actions. He did what was necessary to protect himself, his career, and his future. And in the end, he had won. It had been 2 years since Richard had cut Abigail and Victoria out of his life. 2 years since he watched their worlds collapse on the driveway of her mother's house. He had witnessed the destruction of their lives, built on deception and lies, and now the wounds they had inflicted on him were finally beginning to heal. 3 months after the divorce, Richard sold the house. Too many memories haunted him within those walls: the laughter that now felt hollow, the moments when he was happy, now tainted by betrayal. Staying there was impossible. He found a new home, smaller and simpler, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood where no one knew him or his story. It was exactly what he needed: a fresh start. On his first night in the new house, Richard stood in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand, looking out at the unfamiliar streets. The silence around him was comforting, a welcome refuge from the chaos that had once been his life. No more whispers, no more rumors, only peace. Richard no longer needed to pretend, no longer needed to force a smile next to a woman who had long stopped caring for him. The tension that once filled every interaction with Victoria had dissolved. Now, in its place, there was a quiet, peaceful solitude. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted by a knock at the door, unexpected and unfamiliar. Setting down his glass, Richard cautiously approached the door and opened it, finding someone he hadn't seen in many years: Margaret, an old friend from his university days. After graduation, they had lost touch, only briefly encountering each other at a recent business event. Seeing her now, he smiled. A genuine smile, something he hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. "I thought you might need some company on your first night here," Margaret said with a warm smile, raising a bottle of wine so he could see it. Richard, still smiling, stepped aside, inviting her in. "I'd appreciate that," he admitted, closing the door behind her. They moved to the couch, quickly slipping into a relaxed conversation, reminiscing about their university days and discussing the time that had passed. Margaret knew about his divorce, but never pried into the details. She didn't need to. Margaret had a gift for understanding the pain of betrayal without needing words. Their conversation flowed easily, without pressure or expectations. It was just two old friends sharing an evening, with no need for explanations or pretenses. As the evening wore on, Richard began to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time: warmth, a sense of comfort that had nothing to do with the wine. It was the realization that life was moving forward. Margaret was not Abigail. She expected nothing from him other than his company. For the first time in many years, Richard wondered if he could let someone into his life again. Time passed, and what had started as a simple reconnection turned into something much more. Margaret was unlike anyone he had known before: honest, compassionate, and supportive in moments when he didn't even realize he needed it. She never insisted on him talking about the past, allowing him to open up when he was ready. Over time, Richard began to share everything: the pain, the betrayal, the anger that had once consumed him. Margaret listened without judgment, always patient, always understanding. One evening, after a quiet dinner, They sat together on the porch of their new home, watching the sun set over the horizon. "Do you ever think about them?" Margaret asked gently. She had never mentioned Abigail or Victoria before, knowing that it was a wound that needed time to heal. Richard took a deep breath, considering his response. "Not like I used to," he said quietly. "There was a time when it was all I could think about, the betrayal, the anger. It consumed me." He paused, gazing at the fading glow of the sky. "But now it's just memories." Margaret squeezed his hand. "Do you regret how it all ended?" He shook his head. "No, I did what I had to. They made their choices and I made mine. I don't regret anything." Meanwhile, Abigail and Daniel were struggling to cope with the consequences of their actions. After being released from prison, their lives were in ruins. The affair, the lie about the child's paternity, it had destroyed everything. Daniel had lost his career and reputation, and Abigail, once confident and manipulative, was now steeped in shame. They stayed together, but their relationship had become an empty shell of what it once was, devoid of passion and filled only with guilt and regret. Abigail, unable to move on, was tormented by her choices. Every day, the weight of her mistakes consumed her. She couldn't stop thinking about how everything had fallen apart. She longed for the life she once had with Richard, for the security and stability he had provided. But that life was gone, and she knew she had no one to blame but herself. As for Victoria, she had distanced herself from both parents. Though she had once tried to rebuild her relationship with Richard after the divorce, his decision to sever all ties had been final. There was no going back. Victoria finally understood why everything had collapsed the way it did. She had once humiliated him, conspired with her mother to deceive him, and treated him with complete disdain. The weight of her actions, especially the cruel words she had spoken, now pressed heavily on her conscience. Living in solitude, Victoria felt lost, deprived of her family's support, and was trying to figure out who she truly was and where her real place was. Her past mistakes haunted her like an unrelenting shadow, constantly reminding her of how she had pushed her father away and lost the love she had so carelessly taken for granted. One day, Richard received a letter at his home. It was from Victoria. He stared at the envelope for what seemed like an eternity before mustering the courage to open it. The note inside was brief, her shaky handwriting betraying the depth of the emotions behind each word. "Dad, I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I have to say that I'm deeply sorry. I regret everything. I was naive and reckless, and I didn't realize what I was losing until it was too late. I hope you're doing well. I love you, even if we never speak again. Forgive me, Victoria." Richard read the letter twice, his heart overwhelmed with conflicting emotions. For a moment, he thought about responding, but in the end, he carefully folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. He wasn't ready yet. Perhaps one day he would be, but not today. Richard's life with Margaret was peaceful. Together, they traveled to places Richard had always dreamed of, but never had the chance to visit before. After selling his business, he took up consulting, work that allowed him to set his own pace and live more freely. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Margaret looked at him and smiled. "You look content," she said softly. Richard paused, reflecting for a moment, and realized she was right. After years of chaos and heartache, he had finally found true happiness. The bitterness, pain, and betrayal all seemed so distant now. He had been able to move on, rebuild his life, and find someone who truly cared for him. "I am happy," Richard replied, gently squeezing Margaret's hand. For the first time in a long while, he was truly happy. And with that realization, Richard let go of the past. The years of pain, betrayal, and sorrow were behind him, and now only the future mattered. A future filled with love, trust, and peace. As for the betrayers, They were left to live with the consequences of their actions. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.